Hello, we are going to be reading The American Plague. This is one of the options that you could pick for your book project. It is the true and terrifying story of the yellow fever epidemic in 1793. This fits in with where we're talking about historically speaking, right after the signing of the Constitution. It also fits in with the epidemic that we're currently dealing with. So, if this is what you would like for your book project, feel free to listen along. Chapter 1, No One Noticed. About this time, the destroying scourge, a malignant fever, crept in among us. Matthew Carey, November 1793. Saturday, August 1793. The sun came up, as it had every day since the end of May, hot, bright, and unrelenting. The swamps and marshes south of Philadelphia had already lost a great deal of water to the intense heat, while the Delaware and Schuylkill rivers had receded to reveal long stretches of their muddy, root-choked banks. Dead fish and gooey vegetable matter were exposed and rotted, while swarms of insects droned in the heavy, humid air. In Philadelphia itself, an increasing number of cats were dropping every day, attracting, one Philadelphian complained, an amazing number of flies and other insects. Mosquitoes were everywhere, though their high-pitched whirring was particularly loud near the rain barrels, gutters, and open sewers. These sewers, called sinks, were particularly ripe this year. Most streets in the city were unpaved and had no system of covered sewers and pipes to channel water away from the building. Instead, deep holes were dug at various street corners to collect runoff water and anything else that might be washed along. Dead animals were routinely tossed into this soup, where everything decayed and sent up noxious bubbles into the foul air. Down along the docks lining the Delaware, cargo was being loaded onto the ships that would sail to New York, Boston, and other distant ports. The hard work of hoisting heavy casks into the hold was accompanied by the stevedores' usual grunts and muttered oaths. The men laboring near Water Street had particular reason to curse. The sloop Amelia from Santo Domingo had anchored with the cargo of coffee, which had spoiled during the voyage. The bad coffee was dumped into the Ball's Wharf, where it putrefied in the sun and sent out a powerful odor that could be smelled for over a quarter-mile away. Benjamin Brush, one of Philadelphia's most celebrated doctors and a signer of the Declaration of Independence, lived 3 long blocks from Ball's Wharf. But he recalled that the coffee stank to the great annoyance of the whole neighborhood. Despite the stench, the streets nearby were crowded with people that morning, ship owners and their captains talking seriously, shouting. Children darted between wagons and or climbed on crates and barrels, well-dressed men and women out for a stroll, servants and slaves hurrying from one chore to the next. Philadelphia was the largest city in North America, with nearly 51,000 inhabitants. Those who didn't absolutely have to be indoors working had escaped into the open air to seek relief from the sweltering heat. Many of them stopped at one of the city's 415 shops, whose doors and windows were wide open to let in light and any hint of a cooling breeze. The rest continued along, heading for the market on High Street. There were 3 city blocks where 3 city blocks were crowded with vendors calling their wares, while eagerly shoppers studied merchandise or haggled over weights and prices. Horse-drawn wagons clattered up and down the cobblestone street, bringing in more fresh vegetables, squawking chickens, and squealing pigs. People commented on the stench from Ball's Wharf, but the market's own right blend of odors, of roasting meats, strong cheeses, days-old sheep and cow guts, dried blood, and horse manure, tend to overwhelm all others. 1.5 blocks from the market was a handsomely refurbished mansion of Robert Morris, a wealthy manufacturer who had used his fortune to help finance the American Revolution. Morris was lending his house to George and Martha Washington, and had moved himself into another larger one he owned just up the block. Washington was the President of the United States, and Philadelphia was temporarily the capital of the young nation and the center of its federal government. So this was before Washington, D.C. was picked. Washington spent the day at home in a small, stuffy office, seeing visitors, writing letters, and worrying. It was the French. The problem with them was on his mind most of these days. Not so many years before, the French monarch, Louis XVI, had sent money, ships, and soldiers to aid the struggling American Continental Army fighting against the British. The French aid had been a major reason why Washington was able to surround and force General Charles Cornwallis to surrender at Yorktown in 1781. This military victory eventually led to the British capitulation 3 years later and the freedom for the American states and lasting fame for Washington. Then, in 1789, France erupted into its own revolution. The common people and a few nobles and churchmen soon gained complete power in France and beheaded Louis XVI in January of 1793. Many of France's neighbors worried that similar revolutions would spread to their countries and wanted the new French Republic to be crushed. Soon after the king was put to death, revolutionary France was at war with Great Britain, Holland, Spain, and Austria. Naturally, the French Republic had turned to the United States for help, only to have President Washington hesitate. Washington knew that he and his country owed the French an eternal debt. He simply wasn't sure the United States had the military strength to take on so many formidable foes. Many citizens felt Washington's proclamation of neutrality was a betrayal of the French people. His own Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, clearly did, and he argued bitterly with the Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, over the issue. Wasn't the French fight for individual freedom, Jefferson asked, exactly like the American struggle against the British oppression? The situation was made worse in April by the arrival of the French Republic's new minister, Edmond Charles Guenet. Guenet's first action in the United States was to hire an American privateer, privately owned and manned ships, to attack and plunder British ships in the name of his government. He then traveled to Philadelphia to ask George Washington to support his efforts. Washington gave Guenet what amounted to a diplomatic cold shoulder, meeting with him very briefly but refusing to discuss the subject of the United States and support the French. But a large number of the United States citizens loved Guenet and the French cause and rallied around him. Pro-French sympathies were further heightened in July by the sudden influx of 2,100 French refugees who were fleeing a fierce slave rebellion in Santo Domingo. That's modern-day Dominican Republic. Pro-French demonstrations were held near the president's home and escalated in intensity. Vice President John Adams was extremely nervous about this French madness and recalled that 10,000 people in the streets of Philadelphia, threatening to drag Washington out of his house and effect a revolution in the government or compel it to declare war in favor of the French Revolution. While Washington worried, the city's taverns, beer gardens, and coffee houses, all 176 of them, were teeming with activity that Saturday. There, men and a few women lifted their glasses and toasts and singing and letting the hours slip away into lively conversation. Business and politics and the latest gossips were the favorite topics. No doubt the heat and the foul stink from Ball's Wharf and the country's refusal to join France were in discussion and argued over at length. In all respects, it seems as if August 3rd was a very normal day, with business and buying and pleasure as usual. Oh, there were a few who felt a tingle of unease. For weeks, an unusually large supply of wild pigeons had been for sale at the market. Popular folklore suggested that such an abundance of pigeons always brought with it unhealthy air and sickness. Dr. Rush had no time for such silly notions, but he too sensed that something odd was happening. His concern focused on a series of illnesses that had struck his patients throughout the year. The mumps in January, jaw and mouth infections in February, scarlet fever in March, followed by influenza in July. There was something in the heat and drought, the good doctor speculated, which was uncommon in their influence upon the human body. The Reverend J. Henry C. Helmuth of the Lutheran congregation, too, thought something was wrong in the city. though it had nothing to do with the sickness of the body. It was the souls of the citizens he was worried about. Philadelphia seemed to strive to exceed all other places in breaking of the Sabbath, he noted. An increased number of people shunned church and instead went to taverns where they drank and gambled. Too many others spent their free time in the theaters, which displayed rope dancing and other shows. Sooner or later, he warned the city would feel God's displeasure. Rush and Helmuth would have been surprised to know that their worries were turning into reality on August 3rd. For on that Saturday, a young French sailor rooming at Richard Denny's boarding house over on North Water Street was desperately ill with a fever. 18th century record keeping wasn't precise, so no one bothered to write down his name. Besides, the sailor was poor and a foreigner, not the sort of person who would draw much attention from the community around him. All we know is that his fever worsened and was accompanied by violent seizures, and on that day, and a few days later, he died. Other residents at Denny's would follow the sailor to the grave, and Mr. Moore fell into a stupor and passed away. Mrs. Richard Parkinson expired on August 7th. Next, the lodging house owner and his wife, Mary, and then the sailor's first roommate. Around the same time, 2 people in the next house over to Denny's died of the same severe fever. 8 deaths in the space of a week in 2 houses on the same street. But the city didn't take notice. Summer fevers were common visitors to all American cities in the 18th century and therefore not headline news. Besides, Denny was located in a narrow, out-of-the-way street, really more an alley than a street. It was much confined, and the residents remarked, ill-aired, and in every respect is a disagreeable street. Things happened around the city all of the time, sometimes very bad things, that went unnoticed by the authorities and the rest of the population, so the deaths did not disrupt Philadelphia all that much. Ships came and went. Men and women did chores, talking, and sought relief from the heat and insects. And the markets and shops hummed with activities, children playing, and the city and state federal governments went about their business. No one noticed that the church bells were tolling more often than usual to announce one death and then another. They rang for Dr. Hugh Hodges' little daughter, for Peter Aston, for John Wayman, for Mary Shewell, and for a boy named McClare. No one knew that the killer was already moving through their streets with them, an invisible stalker that would go from house to house until it touched everyone, rich or poor, in some terrible way. That's the end of chapter 1.